in this session, we're going to explore the overwhelming number of options out there for how to start a farm or get into farming, and some of the considerations. I thought we could also start by just giving a little bit of our own backgrounds and talk about our own paths into agriculture. So Ben, well, I'm going to turn it over to you. Maybe you could give us a quick biography and just talk a little bit about your path into agriculture, and then I will do that same thing.
Yeah, thanks, Jesse. So yeah, my current role, I think it's referred to these days as a portfolio career. So I mostly work for the Soil Association as head of horticulture and agroforestry. But I also do some practical farming work on the side, some consultancy and some writing. So I have quite a lot to occupy myself. But having been in horticulture and agroforestry for more than 25 years now, perhaps worth just sort of delving right back. I don't come from a farming background. My parents were lawyers. My mum was a judge. So like I think many horticulturalists, certainly in the UK and possibly in the US as well, Jesse, a lot of growers come from a different background and find horticulture later in life, perhaps. So for me, it was in my early 20s. I was living in Italy. I'd left university with a degree in ancient history, which is fascinating but not necessarily very useful. And didn't know what I wanted to do with myself. So my wife and I moved to Italy for a bit, and I was busking and moving furniture and doing various jobs, and then found myself on a vineyard. We've met some friends out there who owned a vineyard, and I went out and helped with picking and bottling and things, and just discovered I loved it. It was, the hard work was interesting and fun. And I thought, right, this is what I want to do. So, didn't really know what jobs were out there or how to go about it. At this time, which was in the mid-90s, there were still a few horticultural colleges and courses. So I just found the nearest one to where I lived, which was in Wiltshire, Raskin College near Chippenham. And I did a professional gardener's course, which was not really about vegetable growing. It was more amenity, nursery production. And it wasn't really about organics, although I've always been quite ecologically minded. But it was a really good course. It taught me the basics. And then I went off and started getting jobs, really. So my first proper gardening job was running a walled garden for a Michelin-starred restaurant in Sussex. So I was always, I was interested in food. I wanted to grow, but I wanted to grow food. I love food. I'd worked in catering. So that, I had somewhere in my head, I had a vision of running my own restaurant with growing my own produce. So that was somewhere in the back of my mind. And then worked in various jobs. I set up a 10-acre market garden at Dalesford Organic Farm, which is sort of quite a big organic estate in the Cotswolds. And then worked briefly up in North Wales for the Welsh College of Horticulture as commercial manager. But effectively always working for other people. So I never had my own business. I was employed, which we can discuss later. I think that's quite an interesting dynamic. But I wanted to work for myself at that point. I'd sort of had enough of working for other people. I wanted to move back down to the southwest where I'm from, set up my own business, find some land, and took a temporary job at the Soil Association, short-term contract, to look for land while I was still employed, and I'm still there 15 years later. And I don't regret that decision. And again, I think there are some interesting dynamics about the physicality of growing and farming. But yeah, so over the 15 years or so that I've been at the Soil Association, that's mostly been part-time. I worked 3 years full-time and then went part-time. And I have tried to continue doing some practical farming alongside that. So that's how I got there, effectively.
Yeah, that's great. It's funny that you mentioned the vineyards, because my story was somewhat similar. I was working this would have been like 2008 or so. I was working in wine in New York City, and I got interested in going to visit the vineyards out in Europe, and specifically Austria and France primarily. And the wine shop I worked in, we focused on very small producers, so a lot of biodynamic producers, a lot of really small scale production. And I loved going to visit them because you'd go to these more commercial places and they wanted to kind of, I don't know, it was sort of wine and dine you, or so to speak. And these growers, though, these small growers, they wanted to show you their dirt, and they wanted to like go out in the vineyards and touch the plants and touch the grapes. And I was really taken by that. And I knew at the time I kind of was ready to get out of New York City and move out of the city and do something different. But I wasn't sure what. And I also knew at the time I didn't want to make wine. I didn't see myself as a kind of person who just made one product. That didn't, for whatever reason, really resonate with me. I thought about it pretty hard, but I really liked the idea of being in agriculture in some sense. So living in New York City, I started researching how to get into farming, and I was reading a lot of books. Elliot Coleman's New Organic Grower, which if you're not growing is kind of a funny book to read on, just on your own. But I was, just really interested in agriculture, and I started to reach out to a couple different farms back in my home state of Kentucky, here in the United States. And I got a hold of, I actually found them through Woof, I think. I can't remember. There was a couple of farms I found through Woof and a couple I just found online, but I'm pretty sure I found them through Woof, which we can talk about a little bit later. And they had an internship, and they were an off-grid farm in southern Kentucky, close to Nashville, which many people will probably be familiar with for the music scene. And that was their main market. So I applied for their internship for 2010. And they had me go down there and take like a night and spend the night in January in an off-grid barn. It was really intense. But we had a heater, we had a wood stove. And so I got up the next morning and I helped them move chickens, and I worked with them for the day. And then we talked about whether or not I wanted to do that for the season. And they offered me the internship, and I came back in the spring, and I want to say early April. And I worked there for the season. This is my first year ever farming. Like you, Ben, I didn't have a background in agriculture. And so my background was in cooking. My background was working in wine. My background was in food, but it wasn't directly in working with the soil. So I started working. I did that internship, and it was very intense. It was every day, all year, or actually all summer, all the way through November. And we have Thanksgiving here in the States, and that's the last week of the internship. So we, processed the turkeys, and then that was it. And then they asked me to come back for a second season, and so I did that. I think it's really I've throughout my career, all of my careers, I've emphasized the importance of just getting a lot of experience, because that helps you so much down the line. And another thing that we should, elaborate on maybe as we go. But I came back for the second season, and it just so happened that the other intern is now my wife for that second season, Hannah. And so we, it was really amazing experience. And the first season was unpaid, and I have mixed feelings about unpaid internships, because mine was so incredibly, I'm so incredibly grateful for all they gave me. It wasn't necessarily money. They would take me out into the woods and show me the different trees, and we would forage, and we would learn all these different skills. So it felt like school to me. And so the fact that I wasn't getting paid at the time didn't even really resonate. And then later they gave us, my wife and I, they sold us a piece of property. So we stayed there for 3 years before we even had to pay them anything. So that was just like, that was a really unique experience, and not everybody's going to get that. I think generally speaking that you should be compensated pretty adequately for your internship. But this was a particular case that I was just compensated in many different ways. It's hard to vet that, but that was a really amazing experience for me. So I did 2 years there. And then at the end of my second season, when I met my wife, who we eloped at the end of that season, we just celebrated 10 years together. And we basically went from there. We started a farm and made a bazillion mistakes in the process. We didn't have enough capital to start. We probably didn't have enough experience to start. We really liked vegetable farming. We'd done everything. This farm that we interned on had pigs and chickens and sheep and cattle, and we did everything, vegetable production, some fruit, like we did a lot. And that was we just got immersed in farming and got to kind of get experience with all of those things. So that was another a really valuable aspect to, our particular experience. So that's kind of our, that's kind of my rundown. One thing I want to mention too is if you have any questions while Ben and I are talking, put them in the chat, and then Amelia or Catherine will collect them, and then we'll ask those at the end of the session. So we'll talk for about 45 minutes, and then at the end of that, we'll leave probably about 15 minutes for questions, or give or take. So the kind of next thing I think we should move on to, Ben, is you sort of touched on is just like, the physicality of it. So I'm a firm believer that there is at least one form of agriculture for every body type and physical ability. But if someone is looking over the landscape of farming opportunities and wondering which one will make the most sense for them physically, what to you are some of the types of agriculture that are very physically demanding? And then maybe what are some of the types that are more conducive to someone that is perhaps, has some mobility concerns? What do you think, Ben?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I started in my early 20s. I was young and strong and believed I was invincible. And I'd been moving furniture for a few months. I've never been fitter. My shoulders grew half an inch in the course of a year. And I'd never been sporty at school. I'd always seen sport as not a lot of fun. I was not particularly good at sport, and so I'd kind of equated physical exercise with sport. Used to do a lot of hill walking as children, which I enjoyed, but mostly, exercise to me was not something that I thought I'd really enjoy. And then suddenly here I was out on a vineyard, one of the quickest pickers, loving it, not feeling tired, really, just breezing through the day. And I think that was one of the things that inspired me to keep going. And then I've mostly worked in field vegetables, I would say, for most of my, the sort of 12 years or so when I was full-time growing. And that is, it is hard work. It's hard on the back. There's a lot of bending. It's hard on the knees. There's a lot of kneeling. My knees are fairly shot. Yoga helps. Whenever I did yoga, I didn't have back problems. Whenever I didn't do yoga, I had back problems. I would say field veg is one of the harder ones. There's a lot of lugging of stuff, heavy crates, bending, all of that stuff. I think it's hard to keep doing that kind of work forever. You do see a few, older broken growers. So, that's one of the reasons why I don't regret, not finding my own farm in some ways. There are elements of it that I do regret, but I certainly, physically, I'm probably in a better place than I would have been if I was still growing field veg. This is not really relevant to this discussion, but the role of appropriate machinery is interesting, and how we develop the right machinery to support small-scale agroecological production. Could small-scale robotic weeders, for instance, transform small-scale vegetable production? It certainly have saved my knees. So that's a kind of interesting sort of side issue in a way. But assuming you're growing vegetables, salads obviously are high value, they're lighter. So although there's still a fair amount of bending, there's a lot less lifting. It's certainly easier to manage. Propagation is an area that I love propagating. I don't have the attention to detail to do it professionally, I think. But I've worked with some incredible propagators. And it's active, you're still moving about, but it's you can do most of it sitting down. If you have the right equipment, then set up, you don't even really have to lift too much. So there's elements like that. Fruit it's a different kind of physicality. There's obviously a lot less bending, and again, if you've got the right machinery, you can mechanize a lot of the lifting. And then once you get to livestock, which is I have less experience of, but probably, obviously, big animals are harder than small animals. If you're trying to turn a sheep over and hold it in place while you examine it, or sure, you have to shear it, that's really hard work, whereas chickens are easier. But I'm guessing you probably have more experience on the livestock side than I do.
Yeah, it's interesting just thinking about some of the points you made, thinking about machinery and equipment that would often, and it has the ability to take away some of that physical stress. So like with sheep, you can get different chutes and things that basically do all the work for you, or do the majority of the work for you. But that means that if you have mobility issues or strength issues, that it would require more capital on your end to get started in those scenarios. So that could be, somebody who's maybe doing it as a second career, who already has a little savings for something like this. That could be a good option. You could really, you could mechanize a lot of different things and make it more physically, a little physically easier to handle. Some of the things that kind of come to mind that may be a little bit lighter, and all of this could be heavy or could be light, but things like microgreen production, like you mentioned, salad production can be pretty ergonomical depending on how you set it up. And there's also things like mushrooms could be, depending on how you do your substrates, what substrates you use, how you do the pasteurization of those substrates. That could also be one. Composting, things like that. If you're riding a tractor that's doing a lot of the flipping, that could be another option that that's one that's very capital intensive to get into because of the type of equipment that you need, but it is something that could be a little bit lighter on the body, but is also is really needed. We need more people, utilizing food waste and utilizing all the different carbonaceous wastes we have from trees, wood chips, which in Raskin's book, by the way, if I may give him a plug, is really excellent. Wood chips, leaves, all those things that are often really wasted. So yeah, I mean, there are definitely, I don't want to discourage anybody who thinks that maybe they're a little later in life or they have some physical issues, physical mobility issues, neurodivergent, anything like that. Agriculture is definitely there for you, and it can be very healing at the same time. So there's a way to get into it, but you have to think a little bit more about how it could be difficult on your body.
And there's even there's agronomists and farm advisors as well, where you need some practical experience to really understand it, but it doesn't mean that you have to be doing it all day every day. So there's lots of careers within farming that don't necessarily involve doing all of the hard graft. So
yeah, that's a great addition. Yeah, there's lots of peripheral stuff within farming that's really necessary. Maybe I don't want to take up too much time on that. So let's talk about how to gain experience, because I think most forms of agriculture are not necessarily something one can learn in a book or online. I know people do that, and I've seen people be successful at that, but it is something that generally takes some physical experience. So can you talk about some of the different paths people can take to actually, start learning about agriculture?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Well, I mean, you mentioned one of the great ones, which is woofing. Certainly, I had that on my list too. I didn't do it in the end, although I sort of did by a different route, just because I happened to be somewhere else and find a farm. But one of the things that I'll talk about is the Soil Association Future Grower Scheme that we ran for 12 years, and a lot of the trainees and apprentices that we had through that scheme started through woofing, and it's a great way of just seeing whether you like it. A lot of people think, I mean, I used to get comments from people in place I went, "Oh, I'd love your job pottering around with a wheelbarrow." And you kind of, that's obviously an extreme, but a lot of people think it sounds a lovely job and then don't quite realize, what it involves. And so, doing a few weeks or some volunteering is a great way to see whether it is for you, or whether actually it's too much and physically you're not up to it. Similarly, volunteering with, for instance, your local CSA, or community farm. There's some of those that you can do some work without having to commit to suddenly taking taking 6 months off work or checking in your job. So you know, or perhaps doing some seasonal harvest work. And seasonal harvest work is quite a good one because it's usually quite high pressured and full on, but it's not for that long, so you're not committing to it. So it kind of just, those sort of opportunities, I think, are a really good way of sticking your toe in the water, and seeing whether you really do like it. And then I guess once you've decided that you really do want to do it, you then have to work out how you're going to gain enough experience to either get that job as a grower, or to confidently set up on your own. And a lot of people do just set up on their own, as you said, and make lots of mistakes along the way, which is fine if you've got the capital cushion to enable you to do that. I was lucky, I guess, in a way, in that I made mistakes when I was being paid by people, so I didn't suffer financially when I was learning in that respect. The Future Grower scheme that we ran, the core basis of it was a 2-year apprenticeship, and it was paid. So that did unfortunately mean that some growers that would have been really up for having apprentices on their farm couldn't afford to pay all year round full-time staff. So that was a shame, but it did mean that those trainees were earning. We had it for 2 years because we felt that was really essential to see 2 seasons through in a place. We suffered a little bit because we started it just before the financial crash in 2008. So we had 2 or 3 years where we really struggled to get enough growers that were in a financial position to take on staff. So we did then offer a 1-year apprenticeship, a 1-year traineeship, and some other training, which worked well, but I would say the gold standard is still that 2 years. And Abbey Home Farm, which is a farm near Cirencester that were one of the key partners in that scheme, are still running their 2-year apprenticeship scheme, and they have, I think, 3 or 4 apprentices every year. So if you want the gold standard of that experience, you can still go to Abbey Home Farm to do that. And there are lots of farmers offering traineeships and apprenticeships, and as you mentioned, Jesse, some of them can be amazing, and some of them unfortunately are just exploiting you as cheap labor. And how you find the right ones, word of mouth, I guess. I paid for my 1-year college course, so I wasn't earning, and I paid them, and probably would have learnt more by being at a really good farm, and still wouldn't have been earning, but I wouldn't have had to pay them. So I think it is complicated. I think if you're offering unpaid traineeships, I think you really need to be giving a lot back to your apprentice to make it an equitable arrangement, which it certainly sounds like yours was, Jesse. And then sort of, I think, going on from there, there are still some colleges in the UK offering horticultural training. I mean, there was a massive dip. So when I left the Welsh College of Horticulture 15 years ago, it closed quite soon after I left, not because of me, I hasten to add. But it was, I think, the last specialist horticultural college in the UK. So I think there has been a little bit of an increase again in the last couple of years of horticultural training, but still a lot of it isn't really production focused or organic focused. So it's something that needs more development. And then, even beyond that, I think you need probably 5 years experience before you kind of, I certainly, didn't know what I was doing till I'd had 5 years. I knew something, but I remember making a terrible mistake when I was at Dalesford. So I'd been growing for, 8-9 years, and I was, it was a really wet spring, and it was quite heavy clay, and I hadn't got the shallots in, and I was really panicking, and I thought I'd just got to get out and prepare the ground, and I took the plough out, and I made such a mess. So I did sort of 3 or 4 rows, and I thought, oh crikey, I can't, I've got to stop, I'm doing too much damage. Left it 2 weeks, came back and prepared it, and the ones that I planted 2 weeks later were fine and overtook the ones easily that I'd messed up earlier, and that ground probably took 2 or 3 years to recover. It's that kind of thing where you can you can have that, I knew when shallots were supposed to be planted. So I'd learned, there was this window, but actually the practicality of it was for that soil in that year, I didn't know what I was doing. And it's that kind of experience, I think, that you build up over time. And having a mentor, I think, is really important as well. And I didn't have a proper mentor, I would say, and I suffered a little bit from falling between two I think two generations of growers. So there was this sort of big influx of growers in the 70s and early 80s, and then there's a massive groundswell at the moment in the last 5-10 years, which is just so fantastic to see. But when I was getting into it, I think there were far fewer growers of my age, and so didn't necessarily have that support network, or because I hadn't come through a organic production route. I hadn't started working on an organic farm. I'd sort of worked in these sort of walled gardens in restaurants. So it wasn't a sort of typical growers route, and it wasn't really until I started working at the Soil Association that I really built up a network of more experienced, more knowledgeable growers that I felt I could ring up and say, I'm out in the field looking at this potato crop, what do I do with it? So I think finding a mentor that you can have that relationship with is really crucial. And I think our role as more experienced growers, or people working with more experienced growers, is really to enable some of those networks to to flourish and to be supported.
Yeah, that's great. I think a couple things that sort of come to mind is the value, you touched on it there, Ben, just the value of getting your experience out on a farm and not necessarily in a school. I'm sure there are some really good farming schools out there, and a lot of people thrive in that environment. But I remember reading Anthony Bourdain's Kitchen Confidential when I was 18, and he was like, don't go to cooking school, just go to the kitchens. And that was that basically has been how I've approached everything. I've never gone to school for any of my, I didn't go to school for cooking. I didn't go to school for wine. I didn't go to school for farming. I just went to the farms or the wine, I just went directly into the business. And I feel like there's a lot of value in that. It takes a lot, because you get to see what the actual lifestyle part of it is like, which is huge. Like you touched on that as well, that, you never know if you are really going to enjoy this until you actually do it. And I agree with the harvesting. That would be good conditioning for you as well. Good experience to see what the hustle is like, what it's like when it's really intense and how hard it can be. But also just gets you a little bit physically more ready, because it's hard to know what muscles you're going to use until you start using them on a farm, and how often you're using them. It's really painful and sore, and it takes several weeks to get used to it. I think there are more and more farming opportunities out there too, just to be able to get a job. I think that's growing, getting a job at a place that's not just a massive farm that's just pumping out vegetables. Like I think there are more smaller scale farmers who are looking for, I've seen more now hiring posts this year than ever. I think it's
I get approached on a weekly basis by people looking for growers and asking for help to find one. And at the moment, we don't have that big pool of growers that have got that 5 to 10 years experience, but there's definitely opportunities out there.
Yeah. And if you're looking for that experience, like if you want to be, because the best way to learn obviously is to learn and get paid at the same time. So, and on a farm. And so, if you can, the ways to find them would be to get on Instagram or get on Facebook and find the farms that are nearby you or in the area that you want to farm, and start, maybe even reach out to them and see if they're hiring, but also just look for their now hiring signs, because they're all over the place. I'm getting a little feedback there from somebody, but another thing that I think, just going to your local farmers market and seeing who's producing what and what looks interesting to you, and just seeing if they occasionally need help, even part-time help. And a lot of farmers may say no, like we have to say no more often than we'd like, just because we don't, it's, there is management there on the side of the farmer to figure out how to use you, and for compensated. But that can be a little bit of a challenge. But I think just going and finding those people on, like I said, online or at the farmers market is a great way to connect. Let's move to something that we kind of maybe can touch on is like the next sort of stage is this idea of maybe part-time farming as a good way to safely enter agriculture with low commitment or capital investment. Do you want to kind of speak to that a little bit, Ben?
Yeah, this is something, I guess, yeah, it's something I'm quite passionate about, really. And I've been thinking about it more recently. And I think, I don't know if it's the same in the States, but here, part-time farming is, I don't know, it's often dismissed as either, not serious. It's hobby farming. It's, you're playing at it, or on the other side, if you have a farm, people go, oh, what a shame that she or he had to find work off the farm to support the work they're doing on the farm. And so it's sort of almost dismissed as just not really serious. And I'd love to change that narrative so that, rather than, I mentioned earlier, you see some older farmers and growers who are, physically and mentally broken. We know farming can be isolating. We know, at the moment we've got these massive changes in the support for farming that financially are difficult. So how do we switch that around? How do we celebrate this? What I've got effectively this diverse work pattern, where rather than being sitting on a chair all day and unfit and stuck in front of a screen, or on the other side, having to still lug 25 kilo sacks of spuds around every day as as my back breaks. How do we sort of meld those so that, yes, we still have commercial efficient farm businesses. It doesn't mean that it has to be somehow not serious, but actually those farm businesses can support more people. You get the benefit of working outside. So, I remain fit. I remain, I certainly, whenever I've been able to incorporate active farm work into my life, I'm fitter physically and I'm happier mentally. No question about that. So how do we build a local food system or that now enables that flexibility around part-time? So it could help both existing staff and potentially to find new staff. We've got a problem with seasonal labour in this country because of Brexit and other things. So could this be a way of building flexibility into farm work? If you touched about not having enough capital when you set up, starting part-time is a really great way of doing that. You don't have to, just give up your career and suddenly start up. You can gradually move over. You can see if you like it. But actually, there's some really great part-time enterprises that you could run. So I think I did just see a comment from Phil Sumption about the biodynamic apprenticeship. Thank you, Phil. But Phil used to run a salad enterprise where he spent a couple of hours harvesting salads in the morning, then he went off to his day job, and then at the weekend he'd do the bigger stuff. So there's some really nice part-time, also enterprises that can be very quickly adapted to part-time. Egg production is another great. You just sort of collect the eggs morning and evening. You're checking on the chickens. I mean, my agroforestry is another. I think there's so many opportunities for part-time in agroforestry. And trees have, usually some intense periods of activity around, pruning or harvesting or planting. But most of the time, you can leave them alone and they'll look after themselves. You can walk away, you can go on holiday. There's lots of things you can do while trees look after themselves. So creating these opportunities that allow people to have an interest and an investment in farming without having necessarily to be full-time farmers and have to buy a farm, which is almost impossible these days unless you come out of the banking world.
Yeah, that's great. It's very expensive. There's I think there's somewhat of a stigma around this idea of having a second job, but I would say that the majority of people who I've spoken to through the podcast, or just the majority of farmers, including ourselves, have at least at some point relied on outside income to help get our farm started. That's so incredibly common. There's nothing wrong with, part-time farming or having a part-time job while you're farming, while you're getting your farm started. Oftentimes it's there can be an advantage to it too. Say you are maybe doing some part-time carpentry work over the winter. Carpentry comes in a lot in farming. So you can maybe do some carpentry over the winter, or you can work in restaurants and you can get to know the chefs and you can get to know their menus and get to know what they need. You can work for other farmers part-time. I've done that as well. I went and did some custom harvesting for a farmer when we were first getting started. It was great. And that relationship was great. And he became somewhat of a mentor. So those are things that are, just don't, I think that, we get hung up on these dogmas of like, this is what farming is, or this is what starting a farm is. This is the romanticism of starting a farm, but there's nothing more dangerous to your farm than starting too early or starting undercapitalized, or just, being beholden to this idea that you can't have another job or have a second income. More often than not, when I'm talking to new farmers or farmers within their first 10 years, they say something like, oh, and my partner was able to quit her full-time job as a teacher or his full-time job as an ex, 6 years in or 7 years in, or whatever it is. So like, it can take a long time. It could take 2 years. It could take 10 years. But as long as you have as a goal, you can get there. But there's nothing wrong with that. I think that's a stigma that we can get beyond. I'm based in the US, but there are organizations and resources there in the UK that, probably we should point out. So maybe Ben, you can give us some idea of some of the organizations that maybe to point people towards. And then we've got about 8 more minutes, and then we'll start taking questions. So maybe we'll kind of talk about that, and I can add on any that I think of in the time.
So there's definitely quite a few I can see popping up in the chat as we go through. So there's probably a lot more in the chat that I won't even get around to mention. But as I mentioned, this idea of, when I started, there wasn't these big networks. I feel kind of slightly jealous in a way. There was the original organic growers association in the UK, which by the time I'd started growing wasn't in existence. And then it restarted as the Organic Growers Alliance just after I finished growing commercially full time. But the Organic Growers Alliance is a really great organization. It has a fantastic magazine, forum, runs events and stuff. So that's from a practical horticultural skills point of view, that's a must. There's the Land Workers Alliance is another fantastic organization doing a lot to support new entrants. The community supported Agriculture Network UK is really good for if you're interested in the CSA bit, and they've got some really fantastic mentoring programs at the moment working with new CSAs and existing ones. I think I saw it pop up, the Organic Market Gardeners UK Facebook page, which is just incredible, so active. And people like Ian Tolhurst, who's just such a growing legend. He spends a lot of time answering stuff on there. So finding those people like Ian Tolhurst, people like Alan Schofield, who's now sort of mostly retired, but some of these sort of growers that have been doing it for 34 years. Anne Evans over in Wales is amazing. There's just some incredibly knowledgeable growers, and we need to make the most of that knowledge before they retire. And so sort of trying to capture some of that, I think, is vital. Woof, obviously, we mentioned. I think someone's put a link to that. The Soil Association, we try and do quite a lot as well to support new entrants. So yes, there are, I think that if you want to start as a grower at the moment, there's probably more support in terms of guidance and people willing to help than there has been for quite a while. So I think it's a good time to come into it.
And somebody asked, touch on resources available in Europe. Do you know any that are in Europe?
I'm not so knowledgeable on the rest of Europe, I'm afraid.
Yeah, I don't know either. I mean, how I would go about finding them though is to track down some growers around Europe and reach out to them, because they're going to be, especially in the area that you're in. So that would be my recommendation on how to find them. But yeah, I don't have any off the top of my head that I can think of. I'm sure
an
there's
organic,
Woof.
yeah, there is an organic growers island. So certainly if you're in Ireland, that's worth looking at as well.
Yeah, and there's I think Woof is worldwide too. So you can I know people have woofed all over Europe, so that's another one too. Yeah, I don't know any specifically offhand though. One thing I did want to talk about though, since we have a few extra minutes, is the um, some other things that you need to, or some other maybe approaches to starting a farm. We talked about maybe part-time farming and easing into it, or having a second job while you're starting your farm. Another thing I thought about is farming with multiple people. Getting a couple different growers together and doing something collaboratively or cooperatively. That way you're sharing that risk and you're also combining your skill sets. Maybe one of you is better at the physical side of things and the other is better at the business side of it. And multiple people, and that way, like I said, you're sharing the risk, you're sharing the capital investment. Starting just there's another sort of idea around the small family farm, and I think that's great. I think those do exist, but I think to be a really powerful entity, you need multiple people working on it. You need to share that risk a little bit. It is very hard on one family to take on an entire farm, because a farm is many things, right? It is marketing, distribution, manufacturing, all the things, PR, all the things. And for one or two people to feel like they can do that successfully, it's really hard and it's a lot of stress, and it can take many years to figure out what you're good at, which of those you're good at. And then you may find that you and your partner are only good at a limited number of them, and that you need to bring in other people. So you either have to hire or bring in partners. So I think looking at it like it's a business, and like you would, I don't know, starting a restaurant or starting a record shop, thinking about it like a business, getting some partners and going in on it, and combining everybody's skill set, is a really viable and hopefully increasingly numerous form of starting a farm these days. I want to see more of that. And I think, it's something that has a lot of potential. You have any thoughts on that, Ben?
I agree entirely. If I'm honest, I think small scale horticulture particularly has suffered from, mainly the people that do it are independent, they're bloody minded. That's why, in some ways, that's why they're successful. But it's also, I think, it's hampered the sector potentially, because they feel they have to do everything, and physically, just in terms of the number of hours in the day, but also, as you say, from that range of skill sets, often it's not possible. So you have a really good grower who ends up not being quite so good at marketing, or someone that's not quite so good at the growing but does really well on the marketing, but then hasn't quite got the supply. Building a business with multiple partners, I think it's so many opportunities, you have to have a degree of trust. There have been examples where people have tried to collaborate and it hasn't worked for whatever reason, or they're scared about, when you've got existing businesses trying to come together, you've got kind of fear of losing customers, or the other person's going to want to grow all the profitable crops and leave me with the Swedes, or whatever it is. So I think, as you say, if you're going into it from the start and setting it up to start with it, I think it's probably easier than trying to pull together existing businesses, unless they're very different. The other sort of big dichotomy for me is that idea around buying your farm or buying land or renting it. And everybody's dream is to own their own farm. Even just buying a field is so expensive now, let alone buying a field that's got accommodation on it. So it does put it beyond the means of a lot of new entrants. But I still think that renting land is a really viable option. I think it requires you to have the right landlord, or partnership. I think share farming is a really interesting option. I think there are a lot of big landowners in this country who are really, really up for encouraging and supporting new enterprises on their farm. So Helen Browning, who I work with on the agroforestry, she'd love to have more people running independent or shared enterprises on her farm. We're looking for someone to run a poultry enterprise under our trees. So anybody wants to come and run a poultry enterprise in North Wiltshire, get in touch. But there's lots of farms looking at this way of doing things, and as you say, you've got community there, you've got shared skills. You can go on holiday because you've got somebody to look after the greenhouse or the animals. It suddenly creates that, suddenly it becomes, from just being I'm stuck on the farm, I've got to do everything, it's suddenly you're part of a community and a vibrancy, and it's just more fun, isn't it, than however much you love your partner, if he or she's the only person you're seeing day in day out, it's gonna put pressure on everything.
Yeah, there's just to, not to plug our own work, but the Collaborative Farming podcast is one that No-Till Growers started. My partner in No-Till Growers, Jackson Roulette, is hosted a series of 10 interviews so far, 11 on collaborative farming. So you can go and see some different models that people have used, and he's continuing that. So it's getting ready to start the second season here soon. So that could be a good resource for you. And those are mostly in the United States, but they're kind of all over. There's some farms too that'll point you to see their model and see how they did it. So we've got about 15 minutes. Amelia, or Catherine, do you want to jump in and with any questions that you saw through the chat that we haven't touched on?
Yeah, there's a few questions that have come through. You guys have answered a few, but Andy Parkinson had a really interesting question. I think you, Jesse, spoke about you and your partner didn't have enough capital when you first started out, and he was asking, and I don't think there's an exact answer, but what sort of capital levels do you need to start a small market garden to get it established? And do you know of any guidelines out there for that?
Yeah, there's so many variables. It's hard to say a number, but you kind of have to do your budget. So you basically set up everything you'd need. And let's say on that list, you have land, like you can mark that one off. It's taken care of. It's family land, or somebody's giving it to you. You're trading it for vegetables. You can mark that one off. You just go down your list. You put land, the equipment that you need. Let's say that you know that you have neighbors to maybe able to plow up your field. So maybe you don't need a tractor the first year. Maybe you don't need a walk behind tractor or anything like that. So that's $10,000 or $12,000 that you can mark off. Just kind of go down the list of everything you think you need, which is a lot. Like I think for us, I'm speaking in American dollars, but $20,000 is kind of like, that would be a really good start. But 10,000, many people have started it for less. It just kind of depends. That budget is really important. That just tells you, that just takes all the questions out of it. You just write down everything you think you'd need, and then maybe even take that to another farmer and be like, do you think I need this piece of equipment? And they'll say, like, what are you doing? What's your market? Those are factors too. Like, what are you selling? What do you want to grow? Who are you selling it to? Where are you selling it? Are you doing a farmer's market? If you're doing a farmer's market, there's an automatic $1,000 that you need to put into the farmer's market booth fee at least. And $1,000, I don't know, that's probably like 1,500 or no, like 900 pounds, 800 pounds. So, that's goes towards the booth fee. It goes towards your tent, your tables, all of those things. If you're able to sell directly to restaurants, maybe you don't need, maybe you can just buy some small coolers instead of buying a large cooler. So there's lots of different variables there that you have to take into consideration. But the easiest thing is pen and paper. Start there, look at everything that you could possibly need, and start marking off what you already have or what you can find cheaply. And that'll give you a good idea of your budget. And you may find that your budget's $5,000, and that's what that's how much capital you need to raise. Or you may find that the farm you want to start is 25,000 or 30,000. And then you start to need to really, really look at doing your market research, figuring out the kind of revenue that you need to bring in, and all those factors too. Because if you start getting into, like, let's say you want to start a composting operation and you need the tractor and you need the turners and you need the plot, it could be more expensive. But maybe if you balance it out with how few are there any composters in your area, maybe you'd have a corner on the market. Like maybe you'd have all these advantages and it'd be worth that investment. So you'd go to a bank, or you'd go to get some investors to help you out. That's just some basic thoughts on that. I don't know, Ben, do you have anything you'd add?
Yeah, and the only thing really is sort of starting small in a way. So it's very easy to rush out and be tempted to buy lots of shiny kit because you think you need it, and you saw a book that recommended a particular. I remember quite early on, one of the places I bought a finger weeder, which is a great piece of kit. Really, really works fantastically well. Probably on that site, we didn't have the acreage to justify the £4,500 I spent on it. you know, it definitely saved me money, but did it save me 4.5 grand's worth of money? Possibly not. So, you know, sort of really, I guess, seeing if you need it before you buy it, rather than buying it and then, you know, wishing you hadn't, or it sits in the barn because it doesn't really do the job that you thought it was going to do. You know, so the smaller you can start and build up, the more you are likely to invest the money in the right thing, I guess.
Yeah, and I also think, you know, we could run our farm pretty much with a wheelbarrow, a shovel, and some buckets, like if it came down to it. But it takes, you know, you have to get the initial, you know, it still takes compost. If you're going to do like a no dig system, for instance, compost can be expensive. So, you know, there are a lot of different things that people don't think about. You know, you see these videos and articles that say start a farm for $600. Like $600 isn't even a market booth fee for us. Like that wouldn't even get you in the door. So there are things that like it will probably cost you more than you expect it to. For all the, you know, just packaging and all the things that you may need to invest in. But I think if you put it down on pen and paper, and like you said, yeah, start small. I think that's a great, you know, work up to those tools. See if you really think you need them, if they really help you in situ. Yeah. Are there other questions, Amelia?
Yeah, great answers. And thanks for that question, Andy. Luke asked, and he spoke to the fact that you guys have spoken about capital, which you've just spoken about, and the experience that you need to start up a farm. But he wonders if there's anything else that you recommend for new starters to invest in skills-wise. I think from that last answer, we know that we need a pen and paper, but what else could you recommend?
I would say machinery skills, you know, engineering skills. I'm not a great engineer or you know, I can use machines. You know, I've used most horticultural machines. If anything goes wrong, I'm in trouble. So, and I was lucky. Mostly, I worked places that had people that could fix stuff. But if you don't have that, it can get quite expensive having to call people in to fix machinery. So, if that's something that you don't currently have, really worth investing in, I would say.
Yeah, and I would add maybe business skills, like just some basic. There's some. Oh, I used to have it right here on my desk, but I think it's Richard Wiswall, his book on managing organic farm business. Just some basic business skills, some basic understanding of of profitability and how that works. It's not the sexiest part of farming, but it will keep you farming. Like it will improve everything you do. To just get some basic business skills. There's, you know, and even if you can invest a little bit of time, this is something I didn't do, and I'm suffering from it now, is invest a little bit of time in understanding how spreadsheets work and how you can utilize those on your farm. Yeah, just some basic business skills I think can be huge. Yeah.
So Jimmy has asked about how can one get experience to grow food as a livelihood when you're living in the city, or is that possible at all, in your opinions?
Yeah, it's possible. I mean, I didn't say certainly. I mean, it's harder in one sense because there's, you know, land is short, but there's some really great examples of people doing growing communities in London, for instance, the Kindling Trust up in Manchester. There's some really good examples of people building skills and moving from, well, also either staying in urban areas and continuing to produce food, or learning in smaller urban areas and then moving up to larger farms. So I'd say it's possible, certainly.
Yeah. I mean, especially if you know of some community gardens, or if you know of some urban farms in the area, or even just some classes. I mean, sometimes you can just you can find somebody that's teaching a class in the area and go and, you know, do a day-long something with them, or get out of the city and go do a day-long class with somebody. That, you know, that's a good place to start. You'll probably need or want more experience than that to fully get to starting a farm, but I think those opportunities should be available. Yeah.
Yeah, I've seen so many talks of amazing city farms, especially in London, Bristol this weekend, this conference. There's a couple of questions that I think are specifically relevant for Ben. James was asking, are there any organisations in the UK offering city and guilds types courses to help new entrants skill up and gain experience that isn't necessarily a full-time college course?
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, there are, I think. So, I mean, we did some work, for instance, with Bridgewater and Taunton College on horticultural and organic courses. So I think quite a lot of the colleges will offer part-time courses, and I think it's really just a question of choosing the right one. There's the Scottish Rural College offers the organic masters, organic farming masters. There's Schumacher College I was about to mention that's just popped up on the chat as well. So there are some, and I think there's more starting up. There's also, I mean, if you're just interested in horticulture as the basic science, the RHS courses actually are quite good. They're not really production focused, and there's a bit of sort of chemical stuff in there that I wouldn't necessarily be that excited about, but it does depend on your teacher. In Bristol, for instance, Tim Foster teaches it, and he's fantastic. So yeah, from a sort of basic botany and plant growth point of view, some of the RHS courses are quite good.
Yeah, on the RHS one, I heard someone recently saying that they're changing, or there's possibilities of them doing RHS qualifications without the chemicals aspects on it, or doing organic ones. So it's something to watch out for.
They're being dragged kicking and screaming into the 21st century.
Thanks, Ben. And then there was a question again aimed at you. Jimmy is asking if there is anything that has replaced the Future Growers scheme that finished in recent years.
No, sadly there isn't at the moment. And the reason we stopped it was not that it wasn't successful in training people. It was more that we didn't feel we had the right financial model. So it was we basically subsidized it for the whole time. It was still quite expensive for trainees, and we had to subsidize it because we're not a registered training provider. So we didn't get any of the sort of money that colleges would get for training people, and we didn't feel that the Soil Association was the right organization to become a training provider in that sense. So we did try working with some other colleges to link up with it, but in the end we couldn't find a way of making it work. So as I said, Abbey Home Farm near Cirencester is doing one. I know the Land Workers Alliance, particularly in Wales, I think, have been looking at doing something similar. I think it won't be long before there are some things that will take its place. We're certainly really keen to support anyone that wants to use what we, certainly any of the resources we developed as part of it. We're very happy to share and support any organisation that wants to sort of take it on from there. But yeah, at the moment we don't have any plans directly to start it up again.
Great, thanks. Well, luckily we've got 2 minutes to go, and that was all of the questions. So
I maybe could add one thing is that you see a lot of these like online courses, for especially specifically to that market garden question. You see a lot of those sort of online courses become available. I've looked inside of the majority of them at this point, and they're all great. Like it's expensive, but there's an enormous amount of information in them. If you vibe with, or if you sort of like the style of one of those people, it may be worth at least like watching a few more of the free videos that they put out and see. But there's a lot of information in those, and they do keep growing them. And I don't have people ask me all the time if I have a preference between them. And I think it's just, if you see one that you really think looks like a style that you'd want to invest in, or, for the farm that you want to start, it's not a bad investment. I mean, in the grand scheme of things, when you're talking about an education for maybe a couple $1,000s, and then you can kind of do it on your own time. So I'm not a huge advocate for them. I like, keeping all of our information free and open to the public, but generally speaking, like they're really well put together. There's those online courses. I think there's some viability there. They can be helpful. So in case anybody had questions about that.
I would have one caveat without sort of picking any out particularly, but I would beware of sort of claims of the amount of money you can make from an acre of land type thing. Not that the information in the course would be bad, but at the moment there's the reason we did a big in fact I'll post the link in the chat. We did a big report from our Future Growers program, and most of the people that went through our course stayed working in horticulture, but the ones that didn't, it was because of the level of income and not wanting to live on on the breadline. You know, it's still hard to make money from growing vegetables in most cases. You know, you can do it, and there are successful growers, but it's not easy. And I think some of the courses perhaps oversell the potential income, and so just to be a little bit aware of that.
Yeah, no, I completely agree on that point. Just base, they're great growing information, but how much you make is going to be dependent significantly on your market, on your skill level, on your, you know, just how much you can fetch per crop. Like there's so many variables there that you won't necessarily be able to match their numbers. And you should just start with your budget and work from that. Yep. Anything else for us, Amelia? Or are we wind it down? Well, I want to thank everybody for coming and all these great questions, and to Ben for all of your insight. This has just been a really fun and enlightening conversation. Thank you all.
Thanks, Jesse. And thanks, Amelia.